Good morning, everybody. Mona again. We're almost entering the afternoon, and I'm very happy to present the next session. I have quite some big background noise, unfortunately. Hope it will change soon. This session is about ethics of AI and the impact on enterprise risk management, which is, of course, super important for AI solutions, but also for RegTech solutions. With us, we have a very interesting, very global panel. And I'm very glad that they could make it because for some people it is very early in the morning, but it is always good to have the opinions from around the world. But having said that, I'm going to give you the mic to Nirvana Farhadi, who is going to moderate this panel. Nirvana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona. Hi, everyone. I hope you're well, and thank you for joining us for this fascinating discussion, the panel on the ethics of AI, the impact of enterprise risk management. I'm Nirvana Farhadi. I'm a global regulatory and RegTech expert with around 20 plus years experience in financial services. I'm going to be your moderator for tonight, and our panelists are Kelly Forbes, Cedric, Jerabek, and Krithika Ragunathan. So before we start the session, I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and I'll start with Kelly.
Thanks, Nirvana. Very happy to be here today. Thanks to RegTech for organizing this event, for Mona for the invite. So I'm Kelly Forbes. I'm the director for the AI Asia Pacific Institute. We work encouraging trustworthy AI. So this conversation is very relevant to our work, something that I'm very passionate about personally. So we work around the implications, the legal, ethical, and social implications of the technology. So I'm sure we have a lot to discuss today on that. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you, Kelly. Cedric, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Mona and Nif for organizing this event today or this panel. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Cedric Jerabek. I'm an associate at PwC Legal Switzerland in the compliance, RegTech, and LegalTech team under David Bundy. I have a business and legal background, and I've worked in the areas of payments, real estate, consulting, and compliance for several years. I mainly focus on compliance and RegTech topics using blockchain, cloud, and AI. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. I can't take credit for organizing this event. This was all Mona and the team. So I'm just moderating here. It's amazing. Krithika, if you can briefly introduce yourself, and we'll dive deep.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Niv. Thanks again to Mona for organizing this session, and thank you, Niv, for coordinating this. So my name is Krithika. Just in terms of my background, I am doing my doctoral research on the liability implications of AI. I'm simultaneously freelancing for a blockchain-based future of work solutions firm, and I'm also implementing enterprise value for Galderma, which is a Nestle carve-out. And I have over 10 years of experience in this field. So I look forward to this discussion with the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so before we get into the questions, we are in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution with technology leading the way. The massive advances of the last several decades have really given us a preview into a future that's previously been reserved for science fiction and dreamers. So the dreams of yesterday's science fiction have become today's reality. And as it turns out, the connection of sci-fi to tech is far from coincidental. A lot of R&D labs find a lot of their inspirations in the books, TV shows, movies that have imagined the future, and their research feeds a lot of the tech we have today. One of the major enablers of these types of innovations is, you guessed it, artificial intelligence or machine learning as well. But what exactly is AI? There's so many romanticized notions of this technology out there, making us think of intelligence equal or greater than our own. We hear things like deep AI, and in movies, when something goes wrong, it's usually because the Skynet type AI has decided to disobey humans and go rogue. Today, we rely on AI for pretty much everything. It helps us choose TV shows, make business decisions, optimize processes, and create new drugs and so on and so forth. So the pace of AI advancement continues to leap forward. In financial services, AI and machine learning are frontline fighters in the war against money laundering, fraud detection, and cybersecurity. So as AI takes on a bigger role in the financial services industry and other sectors, we're also being faced with huge ethical dilemmas. When an organization deploys AI, it may inadvertently deny people consequential services, amplify gender or racial biases presented in training data, or violate data protection and privacy laws such as Europe's GDPR or other regulations globally. So with that in mind, I'd like to move on to our first question. And let's begin by quickly defining ethics in the context of AI. I'd like to quickly ask our panelists what they think on the topic, and I'd like to start first with Cedric.
Okay, thanks. So I think in a nutshell, ethics has to do with moral values or principles that help us as humans decide what ultimately is right or wrong. So in comparison, I'd say law is more of a system of binding rules and regulations that have to be followed and are generally set in a democratic process. I think many laws are in the beginning sort of ethical in their nature, especially if they're principle-based. One example would be human rights, that nobody should be discriminated against, everybody should be treated equally. And then in the context of AI, ethics broadly will focus on what AI systems should and should not do, meaning what should we as humans allow them to do?
Thank you, Cedric. Krithika, what's your view on that?
From my perspective, it looks at it from a threefold way. One is humanity. So what is the implications of humanity and the interactions with technology and how the technology or AI makes humans behave? The second is the wider question, which everybody has been talking about, which is inequality, whether it drives it up, especially for how does it distribute income between the people. And lastly, it's about hierarchy of labor. So what happens after the end of certain jobs, which comes into full, obviously with the advent of AI. So how does that impact people? So that's the kind of threefold. And yeah, thank you.
Very interesting. We're going to cover that later on as well in terms of jobs. Kelly, with what we just said in mind, I'd like your outline on that as well, and also to move on to the next question, which so how do we address these issues and what are the biggest risks we currently face in terms of the ethical implications of AI and, what is, in your view, the ethics? So over to you, Kelly.
Sure. So I think ethics, to put in very simple terms, is to do the right thing, right? We all have that. We all grow up with that concept, I think. But I think it becomes very complicated in light of AI because AI has that potential of expanding things. And because we're having these machines now to make decisions for us, it becomes our job now to tell the machine what it is that they should do, that it is ethical, right? So in the very famous scenario of self-driving car, if it's driving and needs to avoid either a child or an elderly person, what should the machine do? So this question becomes very complicated because we now need to come into terms as a society about what that decision means and how do we arrive at the same decision in a way, right? So that goes a bit into the philosophical concept, I guess, into what it means, what ethics means, and what it means in light of machines. But I think that to your second question, Nirvana, around what the risks are, I think you mentioned that some of the movies in the beginning of this conversation, and we're not short of examples of things going wrong right now. And we have examples from, large big tech companies that have a lot of AI power in their hands, and they're not often or sometimes doing necessarily the right thing. We have other examples of AI being used in difficult scenarios where, again, we don't necessarily know whether that is ethical or not. So again, it becomes our job to define what the limits are, and how do we want to, use the most of that potential. I think you also mentioned that AI has so much potential for good if we can use it for our benefit. But I think the ethics is a big part of this conversation, but I also like to go a little bit beyond that. All right. So I think ethics is, when I think of ethics now, I think of, all these principles that are coming forward from different governments, different entities that are encouraging the development of AI. So, some of these principles, transparency, privacy, and what do they actually mean? So I think that these principles are guiding us towards what it means for that system to be ethical and how can we actually implement that in practice. But to go a bit beyond, ethics is not actually sufficient if we are deploying many of these systems. So, and I think I particularly like the word trustworthy, because it encompasses a bit more than simply ethics. We need to think about the legal perspective, and that's usually quite straightforward. We all know the law has been significantly behind, so we do need to catch up on that. And then we have the third angle, I think, which is thinking about robustness. How is the AI doing what it's supposed to be doing, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelly. And I guess that kind of leads us into my third question and, the robustness and what have you that you just mentioned. In terms of enterprise risk management, AI is difficult to track across enterprises. And it becomes more critical to driving performance. And as a user-friendly machine learning software has become really increasingly viable, AI is becoming more widespread and in many institutions decentralized across the enterprises, making it really difficult for risk managers to track. Also, AI solutions are increasingly embedded in the vendor-provided software, hardware, and software-enabled services that are deployed by individual business units, etc. So building capabilities in AI risk management from the ground up has its advantages, but also poses challenges. Without a legacy structure to build on, companies have to take numerous design choices without a lot of internal expertise while trying to build capabilities rapidly. So what level of investment is appropriate given the AI risk assessment across the portfolio of AI applications in organizations, and how do we combine AI risk management with the management of other risks such as data privacy, cybersecurity, and of course, data ethics, etc. And with that, I'd like to go to Cedric, please, first.
Okay, so I want to say in terms of risk management, I wouldn't solely focus on the risk alone, because we also have to look at the opportunity for saving money, doing things better, and allowing employees to focus on the more interesting tasks is, I think, what we need to focus on as well. AI systems might not be perfect, but knowing the risk is key to a successful mitigation strategy. I think the investment level depends on the company's appetite to try new things. So that might depend on other soft factors like culture and willingness of the upper management to support AI initiatives. One strategy may be to start off with a few use cases in an area where the work is repetitive, but the problems are known, such as with KYC documentation. PwC, for instance, has partners that focus on these kinds of topics. So for instance, we have like an AI-based tool that extracts KYC information from multiple sources and then compiles the data into a single report for compliance officers, which is an incredibly time-saving tool.
Thank you, Cedric. Krithika, how about yourself? What is your view on that briefly?
My view is, for all companies, especially, they make tasks technically easier. So AI will help to do predictable physical work. For example, food packaging in certain industries, and better than humans with minimal error and with minimal risk of accidents, which automatically becomes more ethical. And things like unpredictable physical work is something at this point AI cannot do as efficiently as humans. For example, raising animals in a farm is not something AI can help with. So when it comes to enterprise risk management or values, this is where it has the maximum impact. And ultimately, one has to know that AI is trained by humans. So all the potential flaws and limitations humans have, you can work to eliminate it by putting together a robust process and cybersecurity in place, which one cannot really do with humans because you can't really change them fundamentally. So that would be my take.
Thank you. And Kirli, do you have anything to add on that last point?
Not much. I think everything has been covered here, mentioned. I think that the investment industry has really a big power in this conversation in leading how the industry evolves. And from our work, I have seen a growing interest from investors and in seeing proof of trustworthiness, how this AI is actually complying with, so going a little bit beyond just the conversation of, it's nice to be ethical, but we're starting to see that it is also expected now from organizations operating in this space, that they can actually demonstrate what are they actually doing to show that they're being trustworthy, ethical. So, are they aligned with an organization? How do they keep up with the changes in the industry? Does anyone inside the company has any specific qualifications to that? So I think this is all part of a growing conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, well, actually, this kind of leads me to the next interesting question, I guess. And, bias is a well-established facet of AI or of human intelligence for that matter. But AI takes on the biases of the data sets it learns from. So this means that if the research is trained in AI and data sets that are skewed for race, gender, education, wealth, or any other point of bias, then the AI is going to learn that bias. So how do we ensure that that AI is fair? And Kelly, I'm going to go back to you on this, if you could lead us with that, and then we'll ask the others.
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question. I mean, it's something that, everyone is trying to think about. How do we do this, right? Now that we are arriving at this stage where people are aware of the impact of AI and how, these implications can actually impact people's lives. How do we actually navigate those implications in practice? So I think what I've learned from my work in the industry is to learn to really synthesize the technologies. It is easy to come from a legal perspective and ethical perspective and tell them, these are the principles, here's the booklet, off you go. What does it actually mean in practice to, encompass those principles into building those solutions or even deploying that and understanding what they are? So I think a very good example when it comes to bias is that there's a lot of conversation about privacy, for example, and everyone is concerned with big tech, access of data. How do we control that? We know that there's been new regulatory implications there. But at the same time, the only way for us to access the data and understand what data has been used to evolve that solution, or when I'm deploying that system, the only way to do that is to have access to data, so transparency. So you need to look into the data to be able to tell, is it making any discrimination here? So, do I only have data from, white men? Is that why my system is discriminating? Do I need to bring more diversity into my data set? So I think that balance of principles is also something that's going to become more clear if we are to really fight bias and fight the implications of AI. And the only way to do that is to really, I think, dive into that. And that's very relevant to each context. It depends on what industry you're operating, what product you are operating, and what are the perspectives that you come with when you're deploying that system. So yeah, it's a very long conversation. It's not a simple one.
I know. And, your point with regards to as, someone with a legal or regulatory background, it's oftentimes quite hard to bridge the gap of understanding the tech language that's needed and getting the understanding of the tech. And of course, AI, in order for it to be more accurate, needs access to vast amounts of data sets. So, Krithika, I'd like to get your take on that question. If you've got anything to add with regards to that, and how do we mitigate bias with AI?
I guess I'll have to just add on to Kelly's point. It's about data. So the thing is, if it's AI is trained by people, so it's to make sure you get the right data set of people and the right amount of data. And as with building any technology, there will be hiccups along the way. So people who will volunteer to present data first is not necessarily going to be the right batch of people. So it's as the systems expand and as it's used more and more, and that's when you can improve it, as with all products. So that would be my take.
Absolutely. Thank you, Krithika. And Cedric, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think we've already said it. It's about data, selecting the right data. But what I'd like to say is also we need to really monitor what happens with the AI systems, because this is a key aspect. Because it's not enough to just select the right data. A year, 2 or 3 or 5 can go by, and then you have a data drift. And we really need to make sure that we're selecting the right people. We're selecting an intercultural group of people that are selecting the data. And then we really need to think about the entire life cycle of the entire AI life cycle, for that matter, to prevent bias. And it's not a simple task, but I think it's manageable.
I agree. It's an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a juicy one for the panel now. So, in well-documented case that when we saw an Uber autonomous driver vehicle that killed a pedestrian, this raised a lot of ethical questions. And one of the key issues which was raised was who's responsible and who's to blame when something goes wrong? Do we blame the developer who wrote the code, the sensor, the hardware manufacturer, Uber itself, the Uber supervisor sitting in the car, or the pedestrian for crossing outside a crosswalk? Of course, it's reflective of the automotive sector, but in any sector, when it comes to risk and liability, what would you say? Who is responsible and who should be responsible for the AI? And I'd like to start with Cedric on that one.
Okay, well, I think at the beginning it's always tragic when something goes wrong, right? Especially when you have something as dear as someone's life. We can't disclaim that. But I think in most jurisdictions, you have some sort of product liability or strict liability regimes that already regulate this, or can be very simply adapt, or not. Well, I'm not going to say simply, but it's a bit of a fundamental shift where we've had liability directed at humans, and now we have them directed as machines or products. So it's a bit of a different situation. But there clearly needs to be sort of a risk-based approach to this liability. I think the liability needs to be proportionate, and there needs to be a way for AI producers to exculpate themselves through, for example, state-of-the-art risk management, monitoring. We can't just focus on the risks. I think risks will invariably materialize. We also haven't talked about the benefits. How do you compare the risks that materialize from humans versus machines? So, for example, in the US, there are over 16,000 car crashes every day and about 100 deaths. What would you say if that number was reduced to 1%? So on a daily basis, let's say there was 16 crashes and 1 death. At the end of the day, we'll need to decide what error rate we're willing to accept. And I think it's the governing bodies, that the legislatures and it's society in general that needs to decide who's going to be liable and to what degree.
Absolutely. And Kelly, you mentioned earlier about autonomous cars, etc. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a good example, and I think we're not short of examples as well in other industries. So I know self-driving cars are one example of things going very wrong.
This is a right in your face example, though, right? It's talking about human life and those implications, and I think that's why I think it's fascinating when it comes to this.
Yeah.
So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with Cedric. I think the distribution needs to be distributed. So, in the same scenario that we had recently where, an AI system was making decisions about students and they lost their place in universities, who has the responsibility in that occasion, right? So say you have students that have gone on and committed suicide, so it's that system, right? Is the person who developed the system, or is the university that deployed? And I think that is all of us. The responsibility is for us to think about upfront, how is that going to be distributed before the machine is out there making decisions for us. But also to go to Cedric's point about self-driving cars, this is a very good observation that before we go on and make accusations about, if this is AI or is a machine, we need to also think about, if we think about overall how many road accidents there are in a year, and self-driving cars, the fact that it's being proven and they can actually reduce that, we need to balance that out. So I think it needs to be a big part of this conversation needs to come from the regulatory space in catching up with the technology and thinking about how we're actually going to place responsibility, given that this technology can help us to make roads more safe.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think it's really interesting question, and it opens up a whole host of questions, who is responsible? And I think what's critical to point out here is that human intellectual capital never really goes away. Now, whether it's in form of some kind of a kill switch or what have you, but something that can override that. And at the same time, who's accountable, who's going to be responsible? And I think, as you both mentioned, it's a joint, it's not just one area that's responsible for that. So thank you so much for your insights on that. And Krithika, anything you have, any observations on that last question?
I think Kelly and Cedric have summarized it quite a bit, even though you could talk a lot on this topic. One thing I would add is maybe what could work is to have a robust risk process to be put in place to say as a check. So these are all the steps which have been followed by this AI technology to minimize accidents, because then it will minimize the probabilities and get it to a state where the risk-benefit analysis compared to a human driver would be acceptable to regulators and also people from an ethical perspective.
And I think this is also another point where the developing compliance by design, embedding compliance by design whilst developing these products is a key factor in kind of helping to mitigate some of these risks, I think. Okay, so moving on, and Krithika, I want to start with you because you mentioned this earlier in what you were saying. And so there's a concern that repeatedly appears in the press, and that's AI is going to take away jobs from humans. So how true is this in your opinion, and what can be done about it?
The thing is, AI has taken away some jobs from humans, especially say in food manufacturing areas where they have a lot of repetitive tasks which can be done. But what needs to be looked at is historically jobs have been replaced with technology. At one point, there were telephone operators who physically did things. There were people who were secretaries whose only job was to type up notes for others. So these are jobs which have been eliminated by technology and done better, and people have moved on to doing more complex roles. So what needs to be looked on with this technology, and it's a wider perspective for employers or companies choosing to adopt the technology, and even from a regulatory perspective, is to train the people to take up more complex tasks. So as technology catches up, they are also evolved to move on to doing roles which are better for them, intellectually, rather than just sticking to, saying, oh, this is going to take away my current job.
Thank you. Very interesting. Cedric, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Krithika already said it. I think technology will always take away jobs from humans more than any other factor. In contrast to what most nationalist parties claim about, for instance, immigration, it's a reality of life that technology will take away our jobs. It's been happening for centuries. I mean, or millennia, or and even economists have looked at this. If you know the famous economist Solow, he's come up with the famous Solow model, which says technology even is the decisive factor in in growth. So this is the key to for an economy to grow, and it will take away jobs, obviously. But I think what we need to do is make sure that people remain involved in the technology in order to improve it, to use it, and to focus on the more difficult and, I say, mentally stimulating tasks. We also need to invest into training to make sure we don't lose, older employees who generally have other valuable forms of intelligence, such as emotional intelligence and leadership. Those are my views.
Yeah, so it goes back to that whole human intellectual capital element of things. And also, the way the AI is right now is really, it can also be just looked at as a productivity superpower, right? Because for an individual compliance officer or someone who's in that industry, when you can automate your processes and make all these decisions faster and more efficiently, then, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to take over your job, but actually enhance your job. With that, Kelly, I'd like to ask you the next question. And I think it's an interesting question. The companies that are spending a lot of money on AI development today are companies that have a lot of money and wealth to spend. So a major ethical concern is that, will it only serve to centralize wealth further? And what are your views? Who actually gets to benefit from AI?
Yeah, this is a very large concern, and it goes to this social gap that we might be experiencing as AI progresses. And of course, it's in the hands of people that already have power, already have the money, or countries that already have the money and power to control and develop the technology, right? And we already seeing this. I mean, that is no secret to that there are 2 or 3 countries that are really leading this race for AI. And the concern is this digital divide that we have, right? How do we make sure that, in a universal position, how do we make sure that, other countries are not left behind, right? So there are international organizations doing a fantastic job in this area. So we have United Nations, UNESCO, really working to, for example, bring Africa to be in pace with other areas, of technology as well, and welcome that part. And then, beyond, I guess, what countries are doing, we also have this, general idea that, countries that are holding on to all their data, and, the big tech companies are the ones also able to develop AI, because certainly you need, the data is, what is feeding AI. So unless you have a lot of that and a big variety, right, you already ahead of the curve. So, and at the same time, we hear from American startups or other startups that are trying to compete with startups that are based in China, for example, right, that have more access to data, they have the government support. So, so we have this, not necessarily a balance in the industry. And I think that part of our work has been to really encourage that in the Asia Pacific region. So how do we, as a region, come together to have this conversation, encourage that process equally in the region, because this region as well has a lot of potential, right? There are countries that are definitely excelling. I mean, Singapore has been doing a fantastic job, not only in the side of encourage innovation, but also in thinking about the implications of AI and trying to mitigate that. So we are now, I guess, in a stage where more conversations need to be happening at a more international level about how we can come to terms and really collaborate and help each other. So what we do, I guess, with the Institute is to focus on how can we encourage these regions, as a region to grow that conversation and move, a little bit beyond that, that idea that, we're racing towards it in an individual position rather than corporate, because honestly, I think if we cooperate, we all do a lot better in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kelly. And, along with the centralization of wealth comes the centralization of power and control, and, who gets to decide how to deploy AI. That's another interesting question too. But I have another one, which I'd like to ask the panel. And this is a more conceptual one. It's a more conceptual, ethical concern. Let me correct myself. And that's whether AI can or should have rights. And when I first heard this, I have to say, I was a bit bemused by it. But as a piece of computer code, it's tempting to really think that artificially intelligent systems can't have feelings. You can get angry with Siri or Alexa without hurting their feelings. But although my Siri's always answering back to me, however, it's clear that consciousness and intelligence operate on a system of reward and aversion. So do you think that AI can suffer? As I said that, sorry, my Siri just switched on. Let me switch Siri off. There you go. So I'm going to ask that question from Krithika. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I think we're really ahead of the curve with that question, but it is relevant to think about. It's definitely likely is one of those scenarios in those movies that we're all familiar with. And I think it's very much linked to the conversation around artificial general intelligence, right? Are we going to get that level of intelligence where the machine is just intelligent or more intelligent than us? And I think the short answer to that is that we don't know. I mean, the biggest experts in the world are disputing that fact. We don't know what's the pace of the technology that we'll see, and if that will be ever possible. But the reality is that to be in a safe place, we should probably consider that and prepare for it, right?
Absolutely. Well, and from a tech perspective, when I speak to technologists, there is some concern there, even though it's kind of really conceptual still out there, but there is. Krithika, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think it's just one thing to see. I think at this point today, AI is not so advanced where we can say there's a risk and reward, but it's something to bear in mind. Because at one point, maybe in the past, we didn't think plants had feelings. But right now, the whole idea is they respond well to reward and empathy. And as we interact or utilize this technology more to deal with humans, maybe in old age care or palliative care. So that's when one needs to work on training them to have empathy. And then it comes to the fact that they will likely also have feelings and will respond to reward and to be treated a certain way.
Thank you. We don't have too much time remaining, so I'm going to ask this question, and hopefully we'll get to ask the last question, but I'd like to kind of get all your perspectives on this. So the European Union has proposed rules, obviously, governing the use of AI that could wind up becoming the de facto standard for how technology is governed globally. But I think from, reading it, it's very similar in terms of the GDPR that, the new regulations would cover any AI systems whose decisions impact an EU citizen, whether they're a customer or an employee. And that's a market workforce of about 450 million people that most large global businesses can't afford to ignore. So meanwhile, if the companies violate that law, it would be subject to fines of up to 20 million, I think, euros, or $24 million, or 4% of the global sales. So very similar to GDPR. Do you think, what are your views on this proposal, first and foremost? Do you believe it's going to be effective, or do you see any gaps in it? And I'm going to start with Cedric on that one.
Yeah, so I think the proposal is going to create a huge buzz around the topic of AI. I think certainly a positive effect will be that more people will become aware of AI and inform themselves. On the other hand, I'm somewhat worried about the regulatory tsunami that may come with it, as many EU regulations like GDPR and MiFID are known for. I feel like the compliance burden will increase initially, especially for those firms that are unprepared, but in the long run, I think the effects will be positive.
Great, thank you. And what about you, Krithika?
Well, in my perspective, I think the thing is, as with all regulation, it wouldn't catch up with future technology and how it will work because regulation follows technology. So there will always be gaps because by the time the framework is suitable for today, but 5 years down the line, things will change. It needs to catch up. But as with GDPR, I think even though, as Cedric pointed out, it created a huge regulatory tsunami in compliance management, but it created a framework which was gold standard for the global perspective, whether they wanted to take it or not, to see this is what they do and support privacy. The same way, this will create a standard of what people should follow when they utilize AI and then take it from there.
Thank you so much. We're really running out of time. So Kelly, let me ask you this final question, I guess, and that is briefly, how do you think it's going to impact the Silicon Valley firms or other global firms? Do you think it's going to be harder for them to operate in Europe?
Oh, there was certain extent some impact, but I think that what we don't want to see is that, Europe has taken those steps, which is certainly being the steps in the right direction. But what we wanted to see that really as an encouragement for other regions to embrace the same amount of protection, right? What we don't want to see is that this is concentrated in Europe and that for, delaying really innovation in that region in comparison to the rest of the world. Because if we are to be honest with ourselves, the places that are leading AI are not the ones, will not be directly subject to this regulation, right? Unless, of course, it will serve as similar to what we saw happening with the GDPR in terms of, you have that consequence in other regions, but not necessarily directly as we need to see, I think. So we'll hopefully be, an encouragement there.
Lovely. Thank you so much to all my panelists. You've been amazing. So, how far do we go down the ethical rabbit hole? What's the fine line between doing what's right or wrong, or stifling innovation? So with that said, thank you so much to everybody. And I'd like to hand the floor back to Mona.
Thank you very much, guys. I really enjoyed this session. I think there were quite a few interesting points that have been made with regard to the ethical aspects of AI and, where we are at the moment and where we should be heading, what we would desire or what we would not desire. So I think it is really, really cool. And listening to you guys, I could talk with you about it the whole day. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, but I definitely would like to continue this conversation sometime in the future. With having said that, thank you very much, Nirvana, for moderating it and for all of you panelists, wherever you are in the world, because I know it was very global. Please stay with us for the rest of the day if you can make it or chip in, because we have quite a few more sessions to go and very interesting topics as well. And we are now going into a break. So you can also go to the lounge area, you can network there. And I really hope to meet you soon in person as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.